Welcome to the Abide in Me podcast, where we're countering the malaise of modern culture and superficial spirituality by taking aim at the truth. We'll be looking for answers to the big life questions. What was our origin? Where can we find meaning and purpose? How do we discern between good and evil, fact and fiction? And what is our ultimate destination? All links and resources are provided in the podcast notes. Enjoy this week's episode. Hi everyone, as you can probably hear from the bird song, I'm outside again today, taking advantage of the very few sunny, still days that we get at this time of year. And on days like this, you can feel like you're the only person in the world because there's no one around, there's no sounds apart from the birds. And if I was asked to give a picture, an example, something that summed up my walk towards God, what many people call the spiritual path, it would be this picture. Me walking alone on a windy path, being overwhelmed by the beauty that I see, being at peace, and having so much time to reflect and think and be in silence so that I can really focus on what I think has always been the most important thing to me in life, which is this pursuit of truth, wherever it leads. But the path is windy and sometimes unpredictable. Sometimes I can walk along these paths, and because I live in a forest and they cut down masses of trees in one go, I can walk along a well-known path and suddenly it's completely changed because all the trees have been cut down. Suddenly there's a completely different view, and sometimes it's quite jarring, and often it feels quite sad because of course they just decimate the trees, they just rip them out of the ground. Looks like a kind of killing field. And it's such an image of change. I've been here for nearly 10 years now, and the landscape around me has changed so dramatically just because of these, what they call forestry operations. Now, thankfully, they replant somewhere else at the same time that they are felling the trees in another area. They're constantly harvesting and then replanting. And then you see these tiny little trees. And you think at first, oh, this is just going to take ages. These trees are going to take decades to get back to where they were. But of course, it only takes a few short years for them to reach their full potential, let's say, and then the cycle starts again. And there's something about being in nature where you are watching the seasons change, where you are away from society and culture, that helps you, it certainly helped me, see life in a much more symbolic way. You see the natural cycles of life, you see the death and the rebirth, and that kind of symbolic sight has really helped me to understand or get a different level of meaning when I'm reading through the Bible. Because if the Bible is anything, it's a story. The story of God coming into his creation to save it from itself. And so if you have this idea of the Bible just being a kind of massive rule book that we have to live by to the letter, then you're missing out on so much. And of course, what the Bible stories tell us is not just that the cycles of nature are cyclical, but that these cycles of human behaviour are cyclical. that there are patterns that we can discern if we would zoom out from our everyday, often very myopic perspective of my life and what's going on with me at any given moment. And of course, Jesus spoke in parables for this very reason, because stories and pictures and symbols are universally understood. And in fact, ancient people in antiquity were much better at understanding stories and symbols than we are. I mean, sometimes it feels like we've totally lost that ability. Everything is very literal. Everything is dissected and analysed to the nth degree, including when people are speaking and debating about Jesus' teachings. It can sometimes become too clinical and almost scientific because we are so desperate to prove things through the scientific analytical method that the deeper meaning of these stories or Jesus' life can be lost to us. And so I'm very grateful to live in a place where I can just zoom out and look at things more globally, because I think a lot of people can't see the wood for the trees. And in that analogy, the wood is Jesus. And in this case, the trees are the many different doctrines, the many different churches and denominations, the many different focuses that people have when they are coming to learn about Jesus and his teachings. And I believe he is calling us back to simplicity, back to him, essentially, the person of who he is, because that's who we're going to have a relationship with. I've spoken before, actually in a podcast that I took down, so you wouldn't have heard it. It was the first episode where I wanted to give an overview of why I had even started this podcast. But when I listened back to it, as is often the case, but particularly in this case, I didn't feel that it kind of accurately portrayed what I wanted to say. But what I started with was this idea that we are supposed to be abiding in him. And one of the most heartfelt sections, I think, of the New Testament is in John's Gospel, when Jesus is speaking to his disciples that he chose, that he had been teaching for years, and he's basically saying goodbye to them. And so from John sort of 14, 15, 16, 17, this is just before he goes off to be crucified, he gives his disciples their final instructions. And so in John 15, he tells the story, he gives them a story, an image, a parable about the true vine. He's often giving parables surrounding farming and growing, because of course at the time it was an agricultural culture. And so he says to them, I am the true vine, and you, my disciples, are the branches. And my Father, he says, is the vine dresser. And the whole passage is about him telling his disciples that apart from him, they can do nothing. Just as with a vine, a grapevine he's speaking about, the branches are so attached, so intrinsically linked to the vine, that if you cut them away, they'll die. They won't produce any fruit. Another metaphor that he uses constantly, producing good fruit or bad fruit. And so he tells his disciples, abide in me. And it seems kind of strange at first because he's literally about to leave them. He's already told them that he's going to be sending them the Holy Spirit after he leaves. And so you think, well, how can we abide in him if he's not here? And he explains, he says, you abide in my words. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, you can ask anything of the Father and it will be given to you. And this verse, this whole chapter, John chapter 15, was highlighted to me really early on in this bumpy, twisty path that I've been walking back to God. And it felt like an instruction, not just for me, but for everyone. Abide in me. Let my words abide in you. And another word for abiding is dwelling, living with. It's such a close connection, communion, relationship when we are dwelling or abiding with someone. And it's very hard to abide in an intellectual concept. And so if we don't have access to the person, the human, physical person of Jesus, now, as the disciples did, of course, we're going to have to abide in a metaphysical way. And I think this sometimes means to people that it's imaginary. But of course, the metaphysical world is as real as this physical material reality. Our thoughts are immaterial. Our spoken word is immaterial. Our emotions and feelings are immaterial. The words we hear from other people are immaterial. And in fact, all of these things, in many ways, are more real and more important and more influential than physical things. When we see people who are lying in a coma, their physical body is still alive, but they don't seem animated. They don't seem alive. We can't hear them speak. We don't know how they feel. We don't know what their thoughts are. And so for all intents and purposes, even though those people are physically here and present, we can touch their body and hold their hand and even speak to them. But because they can't respond, it feels as if they're not really here. And so I think we need to kind of disabuse ourselves of this very modern scientific notion that the only things in the world that are important and real are physical things. So Jesus isn't physically here anymore, but he's here in a metaphysical sense. In other words, we can still communicate with him. He can still communicate with us. This is going to happen through our thoughts, impressions that we get, maybe dreams that we have, or feelings that we have, intuitions, the sense of being led in certain directions or stopped from going down a certain path. All of those impressions, thoughts, images that come into our mind, everything is metaphysical. And of course, we also have the physical written record of Jesus' life and teachings, given to us by his disciples, who then went on to become apostles, people who went out to set up these early churches in the first century Roman Empire. So we have a record of his life in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have a record of the very early church, the inception of these churches in the book of Acts. And then we have the epistles, the letters that the earliest apostles were writing to the earliest churches in various different areas. And so initially we have churches, assemblies of people living in communities together, because that's what it was in the beginning. In Jerusalem, because Jesus and the majority of his early followers were Jewish. And then in places that we would call modern-day Turkey, and around that Mediterranean area in Greece. And knowing that early history, certainly for me, opened up my mind to see everything through a slightly different lens, because I think often in modern day society, especially in Europe, a lot of people, when they think of the church, in inverted commas, have ideas of maybe medieval Christianity, or maybe the Crusades, or some kind of church abuses. And that can be off-putting to a lot of people. And really, in order to understand Jesus and his early followers, of course, we need to go back to the beginning. So it's all very well having an in-depth understanding of church history, of all the different theologies, But that isn't what's going to lead you back to Christ. It'll give you more information. It might even give you a deeper understanding. But Jesus didn't call us to be theologians. And in many ways, church history isn't his history. The historical documents that we have for his life are within the New Testament. So it's very tempting to jump in midstream or think about the church from our particular denominational background and focus on people that came much later. Important people, like the early church fathers, following on from the apostles, who took over as leaders of these early churches, and then moving on to people like Augustine, and then further on to, say, Thomas Aquinas, or Martin Luther during the Protestant Reformation. Maybe people will focus on the popes and think about the Vatican. You can jump in at any point to church history because it's 2,000 years old, it's ancient. But if you're going to understand Jesus, I'm going to suggest the most important thing is to be reading through the New Testament and, of course, the Old Testament. A lot of people want to throw out the Old Testament. And if you do that, you're going to lose so much meaning and context. It's not even funny. Jesus and the apostles quote constantly the Old Testament teachings in ways that you can't even imagine when you're doing a first reading of the New Testament. So if you don't understand that history, if you don't understand the culture of Jesus' time at that point in the planet, you are going to miss so much. In the same way that if you don't or are unable to see things in a symbolic way, you are going to miss some of these deeper levels of meaning that you just don't get with a surface or overly literal or cursory reading of these documents. And the reason why these words and these documents are so important is that this is how we're going to abide with him. This is how his words are going to abide in us. And so just as if one of our dear friends or relatives dies, we can look back on correspondence, emails, letters, texts that we may have had with them in order to bring them alive again. We can look back at journal entries that describe experiences we've had. We can tell stories about them to revivify all of those memories, all of the feelings that might trigger memories or conversations that we'd had with them. We are doing the same kind of thing when we are reading through the Bible. It's a set of stories that tell us not just about Jesus or any particular biblical figure, but they're telling us about humanity and what humanity's relationship is like with God. It's a rough path where we go to the highest heights and the greatest depths, where we fall off the path completely. And when we see these patterns, there's some comfort in that. And it's going to show us what our own spiritual path is going to be like. Not in exact detail, but again, certainly in the patterns that we're going to go through. And so thinking of the Bible in this way, I think, can help people drop their barriers towards reading it, because they think it's just a kind of rule book of do's and don'ts, either given to us by a very angry God or given to us by ancient people, and so why would we even bother listening to them anyway? And these stories and these words change us. All stories and words change us. Whatever story you're telling yourself when you wake up in the morning, maybe about what's going on in the world, maybe about your position in the world, maybe about how your life is going in general. Is it a happy story or is it a depressing story? Whatever story you're telling yourself is going to affect how you feel and what you think, what thoughts you're going to focus on. People who don't believe in God are going to have a very different story and therefore a very different way of acting in life than those people who do believe. And of course, Jesus understood this, which is why he told us to abide in his words. Because his words give us eternal life. His words are sustaining. His words are going to quench our spiritual thirst for a deep spiritual connection with God. And so it's not just about us reading the Sermon on the Mount or reading through the Gospels and trying to emulate his life or follow his instructions. It has to be deeper than that. His final instruction to his disciples was that we love one another. We love one another. Because if we don't love one another and we don't love God, we're not going to be able to follow these instructions. When Jesus was asked, what is the most important commandment? He was always being tested by the religious Jewish elite at the time, the Pharisees and the scribes, who were threatened by him because they were there to teach people to follow the law of Moses to the letter and then some, because they made up their own laws as well. And so they wanted to trick Jesus by asking him, okay, which of these laws, which of these commandments that God gave to Moses that we're all supposed to be living by is the most important? And Jesus said to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and to love your neighbour as yourself. He gave two that are intrinsically linked. And if we understand the love that God has for us, then it will be more difficult for us to be offended or think of things in a negative way when we come across a teaching or an instruction or commandment that we don't understand. And unfortunately, this happens all the time today because people are getting offended in general about anything, but also they have this idea of God that if God does exist, he doesn't really like us and he wants to punish us and he's very angry all the time. And that leads people to have a very shallow reading of much of the Bible because they hone in on things that they don't like and understand, oftentimes because they're missing the historical context. Or there's a commandment or instruction that if they personally followed it would mean that they would have to change their life. And so if our own lifestyle is called into question, then our own emotions are going to blind us from, or our own offences, I should say, are going to blind us from understanding the truth of these teachings. We're just going to dismiss them because we don't like to be criticised. Also, we don't like to think very deeply about things, including our own motivations and thoughts and feelings. We are very much a people today who have been conditioned through our society, really since the 1960s, to only focus on how we feel. If it feels good, do it. If it doesn't feel good, don't do it. And if people are going to question or criticise how I feel, then they are immediately wrong. There's no depth of discussion. We are all on the defensive, way too much. Ironic, really, because of course, with all of this focusing on our feelings, we are also supposed to be getting to know ourselves better. But it seems that focusing on our feelings actually does the opposite. It darkens our mental faculties. In fact, we dismiss our mental faculties, critical thinking, reason, depth of thought, in favour of feeling. And so Jesus gave us instructions that are balanced. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul and strength. Love your neighbour as yourself. So there is the instruction to love, to have a heart connection. But let my words abide in you. Not just feelings, words. And so let's think about how words change us. I've spoken about the kinds of thoughts that we might have when we wake up. Are we thinking negatively? And of course, that's going to make us feel depressed and anxious. Or do we wake up with a spring in our step and therefore focus on the positive things in our lives, the things that we're grateful for? But also the words that we speak to each other are incredibly important. We can build each other up with expressions of love and kindness, or we can absolutely destroy each other through the words that we speak to each other. They do actually transform our inner being. They transform how we feel. They transform our thoughts, the way that our minds work, the way that we function in our lives. And so if our own words can transform ourselves and each other, how much more will Jesus' words transform us? And I believe this is why there has been such an attack on the Bible, Jesus, Christian teachings in general, because they are so life-giving. They are so transformative. And the last thing that the powers that be want is transformed individuals or transformed groups, a transformed humanity, a humanity that is thinking deeply, a humanity that isn't divided, but that is loving each other, a humanity that is not focused on governments or transnational corporations, brands, celebrities, money, power, sex, or any other idol, but is focusing and loving God, is definitely not what the powers that be want, of course, because they want us divided. We can see that just by opening our eyes in the morning, seeing how divided we are, seeing how offended we are, seeing how much arguing we are engaged with. And that is by design. It is by design. And so when you abide in his words, and of course this doesn't just mean you read through the New Testament once. This is what a lot of atheists do. Oh, I've read the Bible. It's like, okay, well, anyone can read the Bible. This is about abiding in his words, not glancing through them and highlighting all the things that you find incredibly offensive from your modern perspective. But of course, as I said, it's not just the New Testament, it's the Old Testament as well. The Old Testament has some of the most beautiful poetry, the deepest kind of wisdom that you're ever going to read. And yet most people's opinion, if they're not Christians, in this modern day society, is that the Old Testament is evil. I've heard Richard Dawkins say this, that the God of the Old Testament is evil, because he has taken a few verses out of context and paraded them around and convinced people that the God of the Old Testament, well, first of all, doesn't exist, obviously, to Richard Dawkins and all the other atheists like Sam Harris. But if he did exist, he would be abhorrent. He kind of gives Jesus a pass, but of course he doesn't see Jesus as being God. The God of the Old Testament is the same as the God of the New Testament. There is no difference. Jesus is the manifestation of Yahweh in human form. And these are things we need to reconcile and learn about. And so the people in the Old Testament who are writing the Old Testament, the prophets, King David, all the other authors, were of course in deep communion with God. And the more that you read the Old Testament, the more that you can feel that. And it is also these words and these stories and this poetry and this wisdom that we need to get into our being. Jesus speaks about his words falling on fertile ground as opposed to stony ground. Because when it falls on stony ground or soil that isn't appropriate, then these seeds, these word seeds, do not take root within us. It's only when they take root within us that they start to grow and produce fruit. They start to change us. This is what the fruit is. They start to transform our being. Because the more that we abide and read and study and soak in these words, the more they will transform us. It's like any story. The more you tell it to yourself, the more you believe it and the more it changes you. Look at some of these people today who have bought into some of these ideologies, hook, line and sinker, and look at how some of these ideologies have absolutely ruined people's lives. They have made them myopic. They have made them entirely narcissistic and self-centered, angry, constantly offended. And it's because they bought into a set of ideas. And they tell themselves these ideas over and over and over again. They are transformed by them. That's what words and stories do. That is how people connect with their tribe. Through words, through shared stories. Whether it's down political lines, whether it's down racial lines, religious lines, gender lines, national or cultural lines. These shared stories and shared ideas bring together tribes. And each of those tribes are transformed by those words. But of course, Christ's teachings aren't just a set of ideas. He wasn't just a very good teacher. He's still alive. He's still very much present with us. He can communicate with us and we can communicate with him. Now, it's going to be more difficult because we're used to communicating with people who are physically present. But if you have a metaphysical understanding of the universe, as of course not just Christians do, but many other spiritual traditions, then you're going to know that communication with the metaphysical realm is of course possible. It's possible through prayer, either spoken prayers or prayers that we are reciting in our mind. The communication happens, of course, through dreams or visions, through our feelings and nudges and intuitions, through our understanding, and through reading these words. And of course, we're being influenced by this metaphysical realm all the time. It is teeming with activity. And part of the reason that the Israelites were told to focus on God alone, don't worship other gods, don't bow down to them, don't pay them any attention, is because of this populated metaphysical spiritual world. And this is why the Apostle John talks about testing the spirits. The Holy Spirit, God's Spirit, who is God, is going to be communicating with us. But of course there are counterfeit spirits. Test the spirits. How do we test the spirits? Well, as John says, anyone who is denying who Jesus is, any thoughts or visions or books that are leading you away from the truth of who Jesus is obviously not from the Holy Spirit. And this is why I highlight all of the New Age teachers and books who are constantly trying to recreate Jesus in their own image, or the image that they would like him to be in. Of course, in Miracles, I've spoken about many times before. A lot of these teachers like Eckhart Tolle, people who even claim to be Christians like Brené Brown, recreating Jesus to be who they want him to be. They are not inspired by the Spirit of God to say these things. And the guardrails, of course, for this is to read the Bible. Test what you're hearing if you're someone that is spiritually sensitive, or what you are reading with what it says in the Bible. It really amazes me that even some of these biblical scholars who are atheists, let's say A.I.M, will totally disregard the earliest attestations of Jesus' life in the New Testament, but then lean into the Jesus that is presented in the Gnostic Gospels, say the Gospel of Thomas, that were written hundreds of years later, as if these are more accurate than the ones that were written nearer the time by the people that actually knew him. And of course, the reason people do that is because they would prefer Jesus to be a Gnostic teacher, a Hindu mystic, a wise man. But it's not about preference, it's about the truth. And when you understand the truth, the veracity, the historicity, how we actually got the Bible, as opposed to the kind of Dan Brown Da Vinci Code version, then you will understand why the Bible has to be the barometer of truth, and not ideas that are developed hundreds and hundreds of years later, or even ideas that are developed today through visions. Plenty of New Age channelers and mediums and teachers speak today about Jesus presenting himself to them, telling all kinds of stories about being married to Mary Magdalene and the Bible isn't true, and on and on and on. It's always the same kind of vision. It's always leading people away from who Jesus is. Funny that that's the common theme. And people buy into it. Why are you buying into something that is new rather than taking the time to actually study the history of it? Well, of course, because we like to hear things that suit our own preferences. And we don't want to put the work in to read through the Bible. I watched a clip with a female scientist. I can't remember what her field was, but she was being interviewed by Lex Fridman many years ago before he became ultra popular in his podcast. And she was talking about her conversion experience, I suppose, going from being a scientific atheist to then towards theism, believing in God, and then finally coming to the realization after much study and toil and wrestling that in fact Christianity was true. The story of Christ is true. What's written in the Bible is true. And of course, Lex Fridman isn't a believer. But she said to him, if anyone is going to claim to be educated, but they haven't read the Bible, it's a false claim. And she wasn't coming at it from a kind of religious Christian point of view. She was coming at it from the point of view of, look, these are historical documents that tell us something about history. And these teachings absolutely transformed the world. And of course, we don't understand because we are living at the tail end of that. And so if we don't understand the history of the past 2,000 years and before, and the influence that Christ had on our current society, how can we possibly understand our current society? How can we possibly claim to be educated? And so I think that's where a lot of the frustration comes from. I certainly feel this frustration when I am met with kind of derision and, oh, you're not reading the Bible, are you? Because I just think, why wouldn't you? That's more the question. Why wouldn't you read the Bible? Because it is so important in our history, in our laws, into who we actually perceive ourselves to be. Being beings that have intrinsic value, beings who are moral. Because what we want to do is say, oh yeah, we believe that we're just higher order animals, but we also have morality. Well, there aren't any other animals in the animal kingdom that we say has a moral system to live by. And so it's going to be very difficult for people to explain why humans should be any different. If animals get along fine without a moral system and moral laws. In other words, things they ought to do and things they ought not to do. No one's setting up a court in the Serengeti when lions have killed antelope. We don't call that murder. We don't say that is bad or good. We just say that's life. That's the cycle of life. So if we're just higher order animals, why do we assign these moral oughts when we kill each other? It's just the cycle of life. Might is right. If I don't like what you're doing, why can't I just kill you? is because we're different. There's something different about human beings intrinsically, not just something that we've made up over time because we have minds. And so to study the Bible is to study the history of humanity, because it goes back thousands of years. And what you realise is, oh, yeah, we haven't changed. We haven't changed. And of course, what Jesus is giving us in his teachings and the way that he lived his life is the diagnosis and also the prescription for us to use to change, to follow his example, to follow his teachings, or try and open ourselves up to his assistance, his manifest presence within us in a metaphysical sense. His words, his thoughts, his love, his spirit, this transformational, metaphysical reality. Because if we have that connection through our hearts, through his spirit and our spirit, we will be transformed. It's not like we're being told you have to really exert all of this power and strength and discipline in order to be ultra good people, because he knows we can't do it on our own. That is the whole of the Old Testament in a nutshell. Humans can't do that. They can't transform themselves just by following rules, because we always fail. We always fail. And so we need help. We need assistance. And that's what Jesus is offering and prescribing to us. He is the great physician. But of course, we're only going to open ourselves up if we believe and if we humble ourselves to ask through prayer. Two of the things that are mightily difficult for us. And so we have to take time. And that time is going to be well spent if we are actually using our minds to study this stuff. And the easiest and safest way, I would say, to start doing this is by reading the words that are supposed to give us life, reading the words that are supposed to transform us, reading the words and letting them soak into our being so that they do begin to transform us, even beyond our own conscious will. Because, of course, they're being planted into our subconscious. Especially when we are reading poetry, especially when we are reading parables, because it's almost like we can't analyse parables and poetry. We have to allow it to seep into our subconscious and to teach us through these images, these symbols, these stories. They are much more easily accepted by us than just kind of dot points of do's and don'ts. What does the story of the Exodus tell us? What does the poetry, the imagery of Psalm 139 give us? Or indeed any of the Psalms? Images activate our feelings, our emotions, our own memories. One of the best ways to get his words within you is, of course, to memorize them. And just as certain songs that we love comfort us or elicit certain emotions, so the Psalms will, when we start to learn them. And learning them also helps us in those times when we're feeling unsteady, when maybe we're not feeling that our prayers are being answered, we're not feeling the manifest presence of God, or we're feeling scared or worried or anxious. We can bring these psalms, which were songs, to mind. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. Or Psalm 103. As high as the heavens are from the earth, so great is his steadfast love towards those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions from us. As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion on those who fear him. For he knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. As for man, his days are like grass. He flourishes like a flower of the field. For the wind passes over it, and it is gone, and its place knows it no more. But the steadfast love of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting. Or Psalm 91, the great psalm of protection. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and buckler. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in darkness, nor the destruction that wastes at noonday. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. Or Psalm 37, one of the first Psalms actually that I was led to. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. And so when we memorize these favourite verses that are so meaningful to us specifically, and we bring them to mind in times of trouble, they do bring us comfort, just as if a trusted friend were counselling us and helping us to deal with whatever trouble we are going through. And so part of this podcast is to revivify not just the teachings, not just the beauty of the Old Testament writings, but to teach people about Jesus, who he is as a person, how loving, patient, forgiving, trustworthy, and faithful he is. And as you come to know him, you will understand why his early disciples went to the ends of their earth to teach people about him, because they loved him. And many of them went to their deaths, teaching people about who he is. Not just the early apostles, but of course martyrs throughout history. And so while I don't think he's calling us to be martyrs, certainly not in the same way today, we can look back on history and notice what an immense influence he has had on the human race. And to notice that as soon as people stop focusing on him, with the secularization of society, that things have really, really begun to fall apart. Because there is no anchor, there is no exemplar, there is no template for people to follow. And people are totally disconnected from the love of God because they've put idols in God's place. And it's never satisfying, it's never fulfilling. And it leads to humanity being divided, fractured, and ultimately destroyed. Destroyed spiritually, ripped apart, because we don't know where to turn and we don't know what to do. We don't know how to live. We lose a sense of purpose and meaning and value. and we devolve into animals. And that's what we're seeing right now, a devolution, not an evolution. So I would say to everyone who is on some kind of path looking for the truth, whether they're calling it a spiritual path or not, or whether you feel that God is reaching out to you in different ways, to start to write these things down. Because of course it is very easy to be deceived when you're starting along this path, because as I said, there is a very populated metaphysical reality that we have access to. But if you are using the Bible as your guardrail, if you're taking it seriously, if you're taking Jesus seriously, if you are praying, if you are asking for protection, if you are asking for knowledge, wisdom, and discernment, if you are diligently studying and spending time with the Bible and allowing the Holy Spirit to lead you and teach you, you are going to have a much easier time than if you just open yourself up to the unseen world with absolutely no foundation and absolutely no guardrails. And so take a note, keep a prayer journal. What are you praying for? Read through the Psalms, learn how to pray. It's not just about asking God for what you want. It's about forming a relationship with him, acknowledging him, loving him. And if you're not someone who's spiritually sensitive, but you're just interested to read the stories and the teachings, then again, spend time with it. If there are things that you don't understand or that you find offensive, please don't just dismiss them out of hand, because when you're first reading through the Bible, it's just a cursory read. And you're going to have to get to the point where you're lessening your barriers, where you're able to see a lot of these teachings in context, but you're also able to reflect on yourself. Just because something in your lifestyle appears to be being criticized, which you probably will be, don't just assume that you are right and the biblical teaching is wrong. Because today, if we are all just doing what feels good, then often we are going to be doing things that are wrong. So this is also an opportunity to really understand ourselves. Look at the way that God interacts with the people in ancient times. Look at the ways in which they fall off the path and turn away from him. It's always to do with pride, and it's always to do with idolatry. Wanting to go their own way and putting other things in place of God. Not wanting to heed the call. Not wanting to live good lives. Not wanting to love our neighbours. Not wanting to do the right thing. Because it's difficult to do the right thing. We want an easy life, and that's just part of who we are as humans. That's what you'll see when you start to read these stories. Most of the people in the Old Testament, not great people. And so the Bible isn't telling us to emulate everyone that we find in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is really a description of how humans interact with God. The prescription in the Old Testament is, of course, the 10 Commandments. And as I've said before, who is really going to be disagreeing with any of those? And of course, Jesus amplified and fulfilled those laws that were given to Moses and showed us how to live those out, not to the letter, so that we are constantly critiquing ourselves and other people for not doing exactly the right thing, but talking about our character. As he said, if you love God and love your neighbour as yourself, you've pretty much fulfilled the law. But luckily for us, he gives us deeper teachings and expounds on that in his Sermon on the Mount, and of course by the way that he lived. And so he says, abide in me, and let my words abide in you, so that we can love one another and love God. That really is the foundation if we want ourselves and the whole world to transform. So thanks for listening, everyone. I hope there wasn't too much distracting noise. Hopefully you enjoyed the bird song. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Bye for now.